Welcome to Eastern State. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the president and CEO here at Eastern State. And it's wonderful to have you all here tonight for this amazing panel on prison gerrymandering. We were really excited to dive deep into this topic. I'm really excited to have you all here in center at Eastern State. This is an amazing institution. It has, as an institution, been around since 1787. As a physical site, been around since 1822, when the site was at the beginning phases of being built. And as an institution, as a site of incarceration, had its first incarcerated person. His name was Charles in 1829. This site is the birthplace of mass incarceration, the beginning of mass incarceration, a site that was also the beginning of the birthplace of solitary confinement, but also a site to really rethink criminal justice reform. It was the birthplace of all of those things. A site of so much pain and trauma, but also a site that fought against so much pain and trauma. So in so many ways, it has that conflicting nature in its origins, a site of pain and a site of the resistance to that pain. And so we think it is unbelievably important as an institution today, a nonprofit, to bring people together in center, and that's exactly where we are, in the center of this site, in the orientation of this site, to take that moment and gather together in a place that removes people from community and gather together in center and bring people to community. It's very important for us to do that. And the work that we do here today as a nonprofit is to teach all about criminal justice reform. This institution began in the early 90s to save this historic site, and we still do that today. Our work is to preserve America's first penitentiary, but it goes far beyond that. We have a Center for Justice Education that does that work for K through 12, but also national work to engage in the understanding of criminal justice reform, to engage in justice education, but also to really understand the preservation work and to really move the needle in breaking down how do we make a more just society in every stage of the justice system. And that means far before people interact with the justice system. If we're waiting to make an impact on the justice system when people are incarcerated or when people are come home, we are far too late to make an impact. We need to do that work when people are impacted by the justice system and when people are coming home. I'm not saying we have to stop doing that. We have to do that work. But if we want to make a true impact, we have to stop it before it even happens. We have to look at it way before that. And so much of this work that we do here and around the nation is to talk about the entire way that we center human dignity, that we center each other, that we come to community, and that we think about our neighbors and we think about each other, and we take hold and really center each other, shine the light on how we do better, and think about the humanity that we have in each other. Now, tonight's topic, when we talk about prison gerrymandering, it's not a topic people can really wrap their head around. It's a really hard name. Let's just own that. People are like, what the heck does that even mean? And they're like, oh yeah, prison gerrymandering, it's a really important topic. And then they kind of just stop right there. We were talking about it earlier. We don't even think the press even knows what it means, let alone wants to do a story on it. And so these four people right here devote so much of their lives and their time to unpacking it. And we're gonna really unpack it tonight, talk about where do the words come from, what are they talking about? But what I'm a little bit offended by is we talk so much about the vote. We talk so much about where our government money goes, and we are not talking about gerrymandering and prison gerrymandering enough. And so we talk a lot at Eastern State about having conversations and unpacking the justice system, and then taking the knowledge that we build upon with each other, and then leaving here and leaving our online programs and going out of here and talking to somebody else about it or doing something about it. So I'm gonna walk away with this, and annoy all my friends and family this weekend and telling them everything I know about prison gerrymandering, and it's going to be a lot more than I walked in with. And so I'm telling you right now, I'm going to ask a lot of questions tonight. We have a whole bunch of people online across the country. They're going to ask a lot of questions, and we'll get them to you. And I hope all of you do the same thing. So thank you all for being here. And before we even get started, let's give a big round of applause for our 4 experts tonight. And I'm also really excited that it's spring, even though the pollen is killing my eyes. And I've made a new commitment for the spring-summer season that I am not going to torture any of you by going through bios and reading them like a terrible kindergarten teacher that I was. And so I'm going to let them introduce you with whatever favorite introduction you would like to give. Anything you want. It can be your cred. I have an undergrad in marine biology and biology. I know, weird, but that's going to be the fun thing that I share about myself. I'm a doctor. Yes, I am, but my undergrad's in marine biology. You can guess later what my doctorate's in. Carol, you are an amazing, brilliant person. I will share for you, we used to be on a board together. It was the League of Women Voters in the state of Pennsylvania, and Carol is one of my favorite human beings because she can whip 1 million volunteers together and get them so passionate about moving the needle and making so much change, and I have seen it in fair districts. So Carol, could you share with the audience any part of your bio that you would like to tell them about to add to that fun fact that I shared about you?
Thank you for that. Is this on? I'm good? Yeah, so there are some Fair Districts PA volunteers here, so if you just raise your hand and wave. Yeah, I guess not many, so that's good, I'm glad
they're out working.
They are busy, and yes, we do have volunteers all across the state, and I'm really thankful for every single one of them. I also have a Ph.D. Mine is in American literature, so there you go. And then I was a youth pastor for 11 years, and that's actually what brought me to this work. I worked with a parish in Chester County, but we had a partner parish in Kensington, and I got to know a lot of kids who were impacted by an incredibly unjust system. I would go see school plays for kids in my youth group where everybody had a lapel mic, and then I would work with kids in Kensington who didn't have a school library. And I said, who decides this? Where do these decisions come from? And then one of the best kids, we had teens from our church and teens from that church working together to do children outreach. And one of the best teens I knew in Kensington got pulled off his front porch, arrested, thrown into jail. And I discovered Pennsylvania doesn't have a required attorney for people who are pulled off. He did not see an attorney before his case came up, and I said, I thought that was constitutionally required, and I discovered Pennsylvania at that point was the only state that was not providing a public attorney. And I said, who makes these decisions? So that's why I got involved with the League of Women Voters. I found a group of folks who actually understood why things didn't get done the way they were supposed to, and in the course of that, I discovered I had never heard of gerrymandering. I had never heard of redistricting, but I discovered from League folks and then from legislators that until we fix this, we can't fix those other things that make me absolutely furious. So that's how I got involved in starting Fair Districts PA 10 years ago. I am the chair, and I work as a volunteer pretty much full-time. My husband keeps saying, when are we retiring? I don't know, but I've been working full-time on this for the last 10 years.
Thank you, Carol, for being here. We have Briana Remster, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Villanova University. Briana, you bring so much to the table, to this conversation and this story. You are really enlightening us with so much of the history and the background and the legal standing around this. Can you give us a little perspective of why you come to this table and what's your angle that you bring to this conversation?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just so excited to be here tonight with all of you, and this really is a kind of a full circle moment for Rory and I, because the first time we ever spoke publicly about prison gerrymandering was way back in 2019. Yes, right? Did I just say
I'll just believe you.
Okay. It's been 7 years ago in February, and so it's extraordinary how much has changed since then, and but yet the conversation has got to keep going, and we have so much to do. So I'm a social scientist, as Kerry mentioned, my PhD in sociology and criminology, and so I am not a lawyer. I am, Rory and I have spent a lot of time assessing empirically, using data to show and figure out exactly how much prison gerrymandering is distorting representation. First, we started in Pennsylvania, but now we are working on a nationwide project. And so that's our contribution is, as social scientists, how does this really, what does it mean in practical terms for beyond the legal doctrine and our civics rate classes? It's about quantifying and providing those estimates to folks who can then use them to do good for the scientists.
Rory, add on to that, and I can't wait. Andrew and I were talking about this as we were walking in. I spent 5 hours on a train today, and all I was thinking was the impact on the data and how the impact on the data shows the impact on the neighborhoods, the communities, especially the communities, the urban communities that people are being pulled from. Senator Street was here about a year ago, and the thing that he said on the mic, you can look at people no matter where they come from, no matter what choices that they've made, good, bad. It does not mean they don't care about where their sister lives. It doesn't mean they don't care about where their kids live. It doesn't mean they don't care where their mom and their brothers and their fathers live. They care about what happens in the community that they are leaving. And that is not fair to make choices for them. It's not fair to take away from their communities. That matters. And so tell us a little bit more about your work and your bio and the work that has brought you here to this stage tonight.
No, thank you so much. And I don't really have much to add to Senator Street's. Shockingly, the politician had good words about his problem.
Great.
I mean, I'm amazed.
Well, Curry summarized a little bit.
Yeah, well, fair.
No, it was great.
Everyone was great. And I'm just playing catch up. So I'm Rory Kramer. I'm also an associate professor of sociology and criminology at Villanova. I am still a scholar of racial inequality broadly. My dissertation work and the work that I was doing when Briana joined our department was on patterns of segregation. And so she came to me and introduced the idea of prison gerrymandering to me, which I didn't know anything about, and said, can you do the geographic work that you did for segregation but around prison gerrymandering? And I'm really lucky that we hired her because for 7 years, this has been the most meaningful work that I've been doing, the most impactful. I have a lot of papers that I think are really cool and interesting, and we use coarsened exact matching to blah, 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 blah to show that segregation was 5% different in this town versus that town, and it's really meaningful and important for the science, but this was one where we actually got to interact with the public and take that data and make it available to activists. And Pennsylvania and Carroll ran with it in ways we only dreamed of, and other states are following, and it's been wonderful, and ESP was a huge part of that too. The intro I was going to say was that I'm a huge FC Barcelona fan, and I'm really proud that we basically have the title wrapped up, but that's less important.
I really appreciate that, and FanFest is just a few blocks away. So please go to FanFest and then come visit us this summer.
The Minion Mall is the best in the world.
Andrew McGinley, once in his life, was my intern. So Andrew, that's what I would like to share.
That's why I'm here.
Andrew, please give us a little bit about your background and now at C70.
Yeah, I am the Vice President of Policy at the Committee of 70 here in Philadelphia. I don't think that's why I'm
No.
here tonight. I previously served as the negotiator for the House Democrats during the post-2020 legislative reapportionment process. So I got to know all of these people. Well, I've known Curry for a long time, but I got to know their work through that process, and I was able to, help advocate through the LRC to end prison gerrymandering when it came to Pennsylvania maps. And it was a really impactful day, I imagine, for academics, but even for me, I was just like, oh wow, we're actually getting stuff done. And we ended up with a much fairer, more balanced map. Well, it could be better. It was a huge improvement over the past. So I felt very proud of that work. I'm the only person here without a PhD.
The wisest of us all.
Yeah, technically.
It's still a terminal degree, so. So let's lay some groundwork on this. Carol, we'll start with you. Can you really just make sure everybody's on the same foundational page and talk a little bit about gerrymandering? If you would like to talk about Gary, you know I'll nerd out on anything. That'll be colonial foundational pieces on that. You don't have to. Thank you, I appreciate that. I spent 18 years at the Constitution Center, and anything that is going to give us that framing and then step through, because it really does kind of anchor us in, this has always been political. This has always been about drawing maps in a way to favor one over the other, to disproportionately favor one over the other. So can you give us that groundwork on gerrymandering, and then can we jump to prison gerrymandering?
Sure. So we always need to start with some vocabulary, because I did not know the vocabulary when I started, and it's important to know. So just 3 words that I always start with, and it's easy to get kind of mixed up on them. Gerrymandering is one of those words. Redistricting is one of those words, and reapportionment is one of those words, and our state constitution actually mixed them up. So just so you know, I'll mention that as we go along. So reapportionment actually comes first, and that's the review and reassigning of congressional districts every 10 years between the states after the national census. And there's 435 seats in the House of Representatives, and if states grow in population relative to other states, they might get an extra seat or 2. If they lose relative to other seats, they might lose other states, they might lose a seat or 2. Many states just stay at the same. Pennsylvania is the 5th most populous state, but we have been losing relative to the more rapidly growing states. So every decade we lose a seat or 2, and we'll probably lose another seat in the next decade. So that happens every 10 years in the year ending 0. The census is the year ending 0. Reapportionment happens very early in the year following that, in the years that end in 1. So that's the first word. Redistricting is the next one. So once the states know how many congressional seats they have, then they have to redraw their maps based on population. And it used to be some states just never did it for their state House and Senate maps. They just left them alone, and cities got larger and larger, and they had less and less representation. But then in 1964, the US Supreme Court said, no, 1 person, 1 vote means you actually redo this every decade. So now by law, every state has to reapportion, redistrict. I get them mixed up too. It needs to redistrict after they get the reapportionment. Then they go ahead and redistrict their state House, their state Senate, and their congressional seats. So that happens in the year that ends in 1. And that's done in different ways in different states. Every state is allowed to decide how they do it. Our congressional districts are drawn by the state legislature, so it has to pass both houses, go to the governor, then you're good. If the governor says no, then there's a problem, and that's actually what happened this most recent time. The Republicans in the State House and Senate drew a map, and the governor said no, and then it went to the court. For the House and Senate maps in Pennsylvania, that goes to the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. Even though they're not doing reapportionment, they're doing redistricting, and that's the group that Andrew served on with the House Democrats. That's 5 people. So it's the majority and minority leader from the House and Senate. So the 4 most powerful people in our state legislature. And then the 5th person, those 4 are supposed to choose the 5th. If they can't, they have never agreed since this was put in place in the 60s. If they can't agree, then the state Supreme Court chooses the 5th person. And so if that person is very partisan, then the party that they're with controls the process. 3 people drawing the maps, House and Senate for the whole state. We were really fortunate this last time. We had a chair who had been recommended by Republicans several times in the past. This time he was recommended by Democrats. The Supreme Court chose him unanimously, and he was a fair broker and really listened, which was amazing. That doesn't always happen, that there's listening. But the American Bar Association has said that redistricting, the way the U.S. does it, is an extreme outlier compared to other countries in allowing political leaders, politicians, legislatures to draw their own district maps. We're an extreme outlier. No other nation allows politicians to draw the maps. And what we've learned is Pennsylvania is an extreme outlier because we have 5 people, the 4 party leaders, and then the 5th person drawing the districts. It's not even that the whole legislature has to approve, it's 5 people. And so what we saw is the 2 Senate folks can sit in a corner and divide the state up between them. The 2 House leaders can do that if they get along, and if they don't get along, as this happened, then the chair steps in. But really, you're ending up with 2 or 3 people drawing the maps for the whole state for the next 10 years. So that leads us to the 3rd word, which is gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is manipulation of maps for advantage, partisan advantage, or personal advantage. And we definitely see both in the ways that Pennsylvania's maps have been drawn in the past. And the word comes from Elbridge Gerry, or I think it was pronounced Gary. He was involved in the constitutional stuff that went on here in Pennsylvania in 1776. But he was the governor of Massachusetts at the time that their 1812 map was drawn. And he signed off on a map that had a district shaped like a salamander. And the press said, "What in the world? That looks like a salamander." And then they came up with the word gerrymander. And that's been the word ever since 1812. Gerrymander, named after Elbridge Gerry. And gerrymandering is unfair advantage. It's a form of cheating. Some people say, well, we should never redistrict. No, redistricting is right. It's appropriate. It should be done well. Gerrymandering should never be done, but it happens all the time. And if you're paying attention to the news, it's going on all over the place. And it's a serious problem. So that brings us to the last word that I think the last issue that you asked me to talk about briefly is prison gerrymandering. And I'll just say a few words because these folks are the experts on that. But that's what happens when people who are incarcerated are counted by the Census Bureau in the places where they're incarcerated rather than their home communities. So in effect, that steals representation from the person who is incarcerated and from their home communities, and it gives it to the place where they're incarcerated. And in Pennsylvania, the only citizens who are not allowed to vote are those who are incarcerated for felonies. So people who are in pretrial detention, who are in jail waiting their trial, they haven't even been found guilty yet. Those who are incarcerated for misdemeanor, all those people are allowed to vote, but by Pennsylvania law, they are not allowed to vote where they are detained.
Meaning they have to vote absentee.
Yeah, so they have to vote absentee, but they are counted where they're detained. So in other words, that gives increased expanded representation to the places where they are detained, takes representation from their home communities. So the census contradicts PA law, and it contradicts the federal one person, one vote requirement, and in effect steals representation from communities harmed by mass incarceration and rewards communities where large prisons are located. And that's a quick introduction, and I'm sure you'll hear much more.
Wonderful job. Our system in general, just to like framing of like how our system votes and generally how representation works is our election system is broken down by federalism. So a lot, and we see this constantly, elections are based off of a federal system where standards are set up on a federal system, but so much of the election systems is given the power to the states. We have it broken up to each state has certain votes that are given to the states and then by representation. And you'll see through the civil rights movement over and over again, if you look at it, one man, one vote, over and over again through the 60s, one person, one vote. So back to Carol's point, it is really important to make sure representation matters. So all of these systems are in place for that, but then there's always manipulation of the system. In 1812, the political comic that pushed on that gerrymandering was in complete abuse of it. It was completely against it. They said this was a salamander god. It was awful. They said this was wrong. This was political espionage. It's like a terrible idea. So even right away, they said it was an awful thing to do politically, and they kept going with it. What would you, all three of you, like to add to this kind of the prison gerrymandering and the gerrymandering that kind of how it pulls away from representations, what you're seeing on these pieces, and not just the vote. What are the other pieces that it pulls away? Because I know we tend to over fascinate on the vote. Yeah, you too, you're nodding right away. Thank you, please keep going with it, because it's so much about the vote sometimes, and it's really not just about the vote.
I just wanted to add, in addition to the political and personal gerrymandering, I mean, historically there have been racial gerrymanders as well, right? Where you're
Thank you.
Focusing on communities of color. You're either, packing into like a hyper concentrated community where it's all people of color in a district, or dividing that community apart to decrease the political power. Each of these systems decreases the political power of those communities. So that's the other piece of gerrymandering that is currently illegal, but different process. It does have partisan roots.
Rory, do you want to add to that?
I mean,
You can pull the court case up too to talk about that.
Illegal,
Right,
but you
officially
basically cannot sue to point it out. Basically, no one has the power to sue to point it out other than the state that is actually doing it, so it's basically impossible. Yep. And then that's going to get gutted even more any day now by the Supreme Court when they put down the ruling in the case versus Louisiana. So we are falling backwards on democracy and representation broadly.
I'm blanking on the name of the Supreme Court case
Calais?
Starts with S. It's like, is it? Oh, why am I? It starts with S. It's like
Or Shelby County.
Shelby
County
County
is the one that happened. No, Shelby County is the 2012, 20.
It really gutted the power.
That gutted
yeah.
the VRA, but there's one last piece of the VRA still standing, and that's the one that's about to go down in the Calais, or I think it's Calais. Apologies if I mispronounced it. Decision that's coming any day now, and John Roberts has been salivating to do this to the VRA since he was an intern.
So the 1964, it was the Voter Rights Act, correct?
Yeah.
The 1964 Voter Rights Act basically said you could pay attention to these kind of voter laws, and if they were really focused on race, then states would have more trouble putting them through. And then Shelby County really gutted it. And then what the Supreme Court said was you could keep it, but you have to reanalyze the measures that you're going through. And quite frankly, really understanding that for Congress to go through that process was almost impossible for them to do. They wouldn't do it. It was going to be almost impossible for them to reset the measure to do that. So Shelby County basically made them null and void to go through, and that 1964 Voter Rights Act being quite dismissed, and there was one leg it was still standing on, and that will come down probably in June, correct? Yeah, so pay attention to the Supreme Court's docket coming out in June. There'll be a lot coming down in that. Back to you guys. Briana, do you want to add to that? Which part?
I'm going to go on so many tangents.
Yeah, so many parts.
Please do.
So one thing to add is to just fill out a little bit more information on this representation versus voting part. Because our Constitution specifies that representation is based on total population counts, not citizens, not active voters, so it is children, it is non-citizens, it is incarcerated people, it is total population. And so regardless of whether you vote or registered to vote or qualify, everyone, that's what the one person, one vote is getting at, right? And that's why we have to redistrict every 10 years, because our population changes. Areas grow, areas shrink, and so without updating our census every year, we would quickly be in trouble with the one person, one vote rules. And so we need those total population counts, which come from the census. And well, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but in terms of representation, the idea is that anyone has the access and right to contact their representative, right? Children, and it's about that representation, not based on voting. It's totally separate. And I know that's confusing in a lot of ways. And really we have like 3 issues are like what collided to make prison gerrymandering specifically, and that's the Supreme Court definition of equal representation as 1 person equals 1 vote, and then, oh my goodness, why am I, the Census Bureau counting incarcerated people where they're held instead of where they come from, which we're gonna go way into more depth in a little bit. But the third thing then is mass incarceration. And so while we have been talking about gerrymandering and how to count people since the beginning of the United States, because how are we going to create our democracy, right? It depends on being able to equally divide up our population to have democracy. Mass incarceration is new in relationship to all those other things. And so it flew under the radar for far longer than I would like to admit as a researcher. And really because it was just a lot more quiet, right? And in the 70s and 80s when prison populations started exploding across the country, there wasn't a lot of thought to how this was going to impact representation, right? And so it's only been in the last 10, 20 years where sociologists like myself have been unpacking, okay, what are the consequences of incarcerating over 2 million Americans currently in across the country for not just them, but their families and their communities and our society writ large. And so it was this kind of hidden thing for a long time. And mass incarceration, unfortunately, is not ending anytime soon. In fact, we're seeing recent upticks. And so, you know, being able to understand how this works is important. And the last thing I want to say on this is that we have how we count incarcerated people. Incarcerated people are the only people that are forcibly moved across those district lines, right? And change happens since we decided how to count people and how to define representation. When the census was first collected, for example, most Americans did not go to college. Well, it's still obviously a minority and a privilege, but very, very, very few, right? And now we have millions of kids moving across lines, right? And we had to adjust, the census had to say, we need to accommodate for this. And so kids get to choose whether they would like to be counted in their home on their parents' census or whether they would like to be counted where they are attending college, right? The same thing with military personnel overseas, right? And so we have made changes for mobile populations, is the term the census uses, and incarcerated people are the only group that a change has not been made, right? Despite this extraordinary shift, which is why we're all here tonight.
Can I just add, like,
Yes,
to build
please.
on that a little bit? The one thing, there's a legal concept of domicile, right? And building on this, like, the census says we count you where you usually sleep, essentially, and it has no legal bearing beyond that. But in all other areas of law, where you live is based on your domicile. And one of the key requirements of establishing domicile is your choice, right? You have to choose to be there. So the census policy already goes against that. And that's across all other areas of law. And I just think it's just so insane.
And it really started as the whole reason, like, how did the census decide to do this? It was just a very basic administrative protocol decision. This was not some type of incredible debate in Philadelphia or anywhere where people were coming to get, like, and thinking this is going to be a big issue, what do we do? Because when we first started taking the census in the late 1700s, very few people were incarcerated, right? But census takers are being sent out. They still have to figure out, just for protocol, where do they count them, right? And so while it matters in theory, absolutely, where people are counted, from an empirical perspective, from Rory's and my expertise, counting incarcerated people didn't matter enough to change outcomes and distort representation until we had mass incarceration, right? But in workhouses, in places like that, it was protocol became just count them where they are at the moment when we take the census, and we never investigated further.
It also wasn't the case. We didn't have the type of transportation that we have now for mass incarcerations, right? So your workhouse was in your city. You were not going halfway across a state as large as Pennsylvania when you were incarcerated. You were in South Philly. You were in the Acme that's around the corner from where I live, which was the prison. There was another thing I was going to say, Dan. It's gone. It's fine.
If I can get back to the representation piece, because Curry asked about that earlier. One of my first jobs was working in a district office for a state representative in Norristown. And if someone was incarcerated in, Forest County or Greene County, they were calling our office, right? Their family lived in Norristown, so they were calling the state representative that represented Norristown. Like, I remember getting, one of the proudest things I did back then was like being able to help a person find out when their family was getting out, right? Because it was so in terms of representation, you're still connected to the community where your family is. You're not calling a representative out in the middle of nowhere who you have no relationship with. You're walking into the district office in your community because they represent you, even if you're stuck in a prison somewhere else.
And just to add to the definition of mass incarceration, when we're talking about mass incarceration, you're talking about moving people in extreme distances. To your point of, Walnut Street Jail was right beside Independence Hall. In 1797, 87,000 people lived in Philadelphia. They all lived from Independence Hall down to the river. They all lived in that small area. And by the way, it was the largest city in the colonies at the time, so in the New World at the time. So everybody lived there. And so you're not going far from everything. So you're right, it's literally going like 2 blocks away from everything. So it's really small. The other thing, and this is probably where you were going, where you were with this, is 2 years, so your time in incarcerated setting was 1 to 2 years. So if you're taking them in that setting at that time for that census, in 10 years when the next census is, you're out. Mass incarceration, the other side of that we're not talking about, we haven't put on the table yet, is it's by fives. So when a setting in the 1950s and 1940s even, that was a 1-year prison term, a 2-year prison term. Even before that, it was even shorter. And then we get to the 1970s, 1990s, 2000, times that by 5, times that by 25, times that by 50. Now people are in for life. They're in for 50 years. They're in for 25 years. So you're now you're across the state, and now you're in prison for 25, for 50 years. So that mass incarceration is not just across the state moving for that, but it's for multiple census takings too. So we're adding that much time. So let's go to that next question where you're like, we're getting there. No, let's go there. Let's completely go there. So we're perfect lead in. I appreciate all 3 of you very much. So can you really dive into this for the audience, how counting a person in a prison cell rather than their home community fundamentally changes the weight of a vote in both locations for their community, the impact of their community, for all of what it means for that vote?
I actually did remember what I was going to say, and
Okay,
it was
go.
entirely unrelated. Entirely unrelated, but I'm still going to just get it out because it's going to bother me. The census actually asked if they should change how they count people who are incarcerated in the 2010s. And 98% or so of responses were like, yes, you absolutely should. And states have been asking for this. Of the census. We're like, please do this for us. It would be great. And the census just decided not to. Again, just a purely administrative decision. Because it was going to be a hassle. And it is a hassle. Somebody has to go figure out what the right address for people is. And no one is currently getting paid to do that. No one currently cares to do that. So you need to make them care. And so again, it is purely administrative. But the representation impact is not purely administrative, like that segue. Right? The representation impact isn't, and one of the mistakes we often make with this, and I'm glad we have been mentioning this, but I want to reiterate it, It's not the person who's incarcerated who is the only one harmed. It's not their family who cares about them who is the only one harmed. It is also their neighbor who has nothing to do with anything at all. It's the old lady down the street, it's the young kid 2 blocks away. It is, in all likelihood, if it is a crime that had a victim, it is likely the victim as well, because we know people typically commit crimes near where they live, which would mean within their own district. So one of the most twisted ironies of prison gerrymandering is if you say you care about victims of crime, well, prison gerrymandering is harming victims of crime as well, right? So they're the places with high incarceration rates are underrepresented by significant amounts, right? And we all know what those places are. High poverty, racially segregated places with large numbers of people of color, right? Those are the most directly impacted because the people who should be counted as living there, and thus they should have more representation in legislatures, and thus state legislatures should maybe care a little bit more about those issues that affect them more than the issues of property tax for some of the rest of us, or whatever the case may be, because they care about property tax. Everyone cares about property tax. Property taxes are too high around the country. That's who's getting most directly affected. The other aspect of this as well is the only people benefiting, and benefiting is a like kind of awkward term for this because they have no idea what's going on, but there are a couple districts in every state that are winning this weird, perverse game, right? There are not 50 districts spread out across 50 different rural, or 50 prisons spread across 50 different rural districts. Pennsylvania actually has a relatively large number of prisons spread out kind of around the state. It's still only about 20, 23. See, about 20 was pretty good, but she corrects me. That's our jobs for each other. I'll get you back. There are 23, right? And some of them are in the same district as other ones. So there are less than 20 districts, or there are about 20 districts that see an increase, right? Pennsylvania has 200 and something districts. I got it from both sides that time. I've set y'all up. 203 districts. House districts, right. I didn't want to leave you out. Right? So rural parts of Pennsylvania, most rural parts of Pennsylvania also are underrepresented compared to those few districts that have prisons. Thank you. See, and audience participation as well. Now I got a challenge for the rest of this. If you haven't corrected me yet, you have like an hour left. Right? So they are being affected. So the story here is just there's distortion across the entirety of this state. How much distortion is how close you are to high incarceration rates or how close you are to a place of incarceration. But everyone is being affected to some extent. What's most problematic is there's a group that has historically been neglected by our government, and that is the group that is now, because of an administrative decision by the census, having less representation from the government that most needs to hear from it.
And I want to jump in. We do have, and you're probably going to get to the data, but I just want to say this is not always urban versus rural. Among our states, our counties with high incarceration rates, Philadelphia has a high incarceration rate, but there are also very rural, very poor counties with very high incarceration rates. So this is not a cities versus rural areas with big prisons. This is poor communities across the state who are struggling, who lose representation to those handful of places that have several prisons or large prisons. So the injustice is not just confined to one area.
Yeah, when Briana brought this to me, I was like, oh, the Democrats are going to love this. Like, we're gonna help Democrats. And my nonpartisan researcher was saying, you're going to do it properly. And then my partisan side of me was like, and it's going to help Democrats. And it doesn't.
I was going to say it didn't. We did love it. It was because it was the right thing to do, right? I'm sure some people loved it for partisan reasons, but the reality was the partisan impact of this was minimal, probably a seat on each side. And so we loved it, but because it was the right thing to do for people that, we were representing.
So what is some of the data that we're seeing out of this? Like, dive into it. What is some of the data that we're seeing out of it? What are some of the impacts that we're seeing? And when you're looking at this data, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, what are we seeing in Pennsylvania? What are we seeing in other states? What are some of our shining stars across the nation, and what are some of our weak spots across the nation?
You want to take part?
Well, can we say that we are a shining star at the moment? So we didn't. You mentioned what happened,
Yeah, should I-
but we didn't before 2021. Our incarcerated people were all being counted in the
Yep.
places where they are incarcerated, and I was sharing with my friends here that I went with somebody from the Public Interest Law Center to meet with our Attorney General back in 2019 to say we want the prison bureau to count people where they're incarcerated, and we got
Do you want me to-
not a resolute answer, but then tell the story.
Yeah, Andrew,
Yeah, I
tell
mean,
us.
I can walk through what happened in
Absolutely.
2021 before we get into the data, because
Please.
it is something that I'm very proud of, but everyone on this panel should be very proud of, because everyone played a really big role in this. There were initiatives to have legislation passed through the House initially to end this practice, right? And so counting people for purposes of redistricting in the community that they came from, right? We talked about prison gerrymandering as a complicated term. Prisoner data reallocation is what we called this, right?
Wow,
So-
even less complicated.
yeah. But the idea is like we're not moving prisoners, we're not moving people, we're just counting them in the right spot. And so the legislation was introduced by then Minority Leader McClinton, and it didn't really move, right? And so when this process started in earnest after the 2020 census, this was something that was brought up really early as like, we should try to do this. And so she introduced a motion to the LRC, the Legislative Reapportionment Commission, saying, we should end this practice. We should be counting people who are incarcerated in state prisons who are not serving life sentences in the communities in which they live, right? That was a negotiated, standard. And the big question for the LRC was, does it even have the authority to do this? And there were questions about this. So, every caucus, the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, everyone submitted briefs to the LRC chair, Mark Nordenberg, who was exacting and very difficult at times, but required us to do really good legal work. And we submitted briefs and basically made the case. We focus a lot on domicile, on the election code, on basic concepts of fairness. And they held a hearing where I believe all of you probably testified, all three of you. And we voted on it and ultimately decided to end the practice of prison gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. But they first had to determine, is prison gerrymandering constitutional? And the federal government has said it is. There weren't clear legal decisions in Pennsylvania Supreme Court saying that it was unconstitutional. So there were important cases about redistricting, but didn't directly address this issue. So then the next question was like, is it constitutional to do this, to change this? And the question was, does this power belong to the legislature or does it belong to the Legislative Reapportionment Commission? And Carol won't probably agree with this point, but technically the LRC is independent. And it was set up through the Constitution as a legally independent agency, right? And so therefore it can make its own decisions about its processes. That didn't require legislative change. And so we all probably sat through a very long speech by Judge Beyer, who walked through each of these questions in exacting detail, and then looked at the election code, which says you can't register to vote in a prison. You can't cast a ballot from those places. And those things were important but not controlling. And so ultimately, he determined it was fully within the LRC's power to decide how to handle it. And we held a vote, and I think it was 3-2. I should probably remember that. But it was 3-2, where Chairman Nordenberg sided with the Democratic leaders and ended the practice.
But then there was a resolution from the Republican majority leader in the Senate. The next time they gathered, there was a resolution to say anybody who would be incarcerated for 10 years or more would be counted where they're incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And for that, the chair, who was trying his very, very best early in the process to be as nonpartisan and amicable and friendly to all, he voted with that resolution. So anybody incarcerated 10 years or more even though many of those people will go home before the 10-year mark.
This was about the sentence, not about
10-year sentence. So it was partially, temporarily addressed, but it's certainly not a long-term solution, but it certainly made a difference.
And all of it's temporarily addressed because the Legislative Reapportionment Commission no longer exists, again, legally, and it will be reformed as a new one after the 2030 census, and that LRC can make whatever decision it chooses to make. It's not bound by previous practices, just like we weren't bound by them in 2021.
And it was only state incarcerated individuals. So if you were in jail, and Philadelphia had and still has, but a much smaller, but still a large jailed population. If you are in ICE detention, you are counted for the sake of redistricting as being domiciled there, even though they are not in a domicile there. So Pennsylvania is a shining star, but it still has more to do for 2030. And I guess we can get into that data. So our first project looked at 2010 data for Pennsylvania and how much prison gerrymandering was affecting 2010 data. And the short version was there were 4 districts that were constitutionally dubious, is how I like to call it. If people who were incarcerated were correctly located where we estimated their original homes, where their actual homes are, there were 4 districts that were either too large or too small compared to others. 8? 8. Why didn't anyone in the audience correct that one? It's been a while since I looked at that paper. We've moved on to 2020 data. There were hundreds of thousands of Philadelphians of color who lived in districts that were right next to each other in North Philly. You will probably not be surprised to know that North Philly was one of those areas. 2 districts were right next to each other. They were the heart of underrepresentation. There was also a district outside of Johnstown, the rural parts of Pennsylvania, that was similarly underrepresented because people had been pulled out of that district, is one that I always remember and like to point out for that reason. So that was a state of play in Pennsylvania. We didn't look anywhere else with 2010 data because we didn't have time, but for 2020, that would have been a middle-of-the-road-ish outcome for what we're seeing in the 30-something states that we've looked at with 2020 data. There are egregious outliers, and there are ones that are lucky that they have relatively low incarceration rates, or that incarceration rate is spread across the geography of their state reasonably well, or they just have such large districts that it does not really matter, right? So prison gerrymandering does not affect US congressional districting because a US congressional district is 700 and something thousand people. Not enough people are getting moved across congressional districts because of this to really have significant effects on US congressional elections. It matters at the state house and the state senate levels. And I don't know if you want to go further or if you want me to keep teasing the shining stars and the debacles.
Oh my goodness.
I can do the shining stars and debacles if you want.
I mean, okay, so we, just to pull back on, to continue Andrew's thread of reallocation. So how do we figure out whether this is impacting things, right? Whether prison gerrymandering is jeopardizing democracy as we know it through the one person, one vote. So reallocating is the fancy term for just for sake of like redistricting and, really just adjusting our population counts. Rory and I use data to remove incarcerated people from the districts where they were being counted, right? And then we used some statistics to estimate, return them to the communities that they likely came from to be able to quantify this, right? And I do think it's worth noting, so yes, individuals are cycling in and out of prison. The churning effect is very real. Nationally, the sentence, average sentence length is around 3 years. So yes, people do get out and sometimes go back before another census happens. But because incarceration is so spatially concentrated, it's in all likelihood, someone down the block that is taking that prison bed, right? That people are, and so it's really, it's about the removal of people, forcing them to be somewhere else, and that's high incarceration rates, and then having, because of mass incarceration, we needed the prison boom, right? We had to find places to put all of these people, which was predominantly rural areas, right? So we're moving folks disproportionately from urban, marginalized Black and brown communities and transporting them across district lines to districts that are very different, right? That are primarily rural or suburban and primarily white, right? They have no connection with anything. They've never been outside the prison walls, right? They're not a meaningful member of that community in any way, shape, or form. And there's research showing that when legislators themselves were asked whether they view if they have a prison in their district, whether they view the incarcerated people as their constituents, they say no, like point blank. When people call them that are incarcerated saying, I have an issue, I know that I'm actually legally your constituent, they're like, call your home office, right? And these folks are often in like real crisis, as in like, I am not getting my insulin, right? Or, lots of other things that are can be life or death, right? And so it ends up falling to the communities where those folks came from. Those representatives for those districts are doing double duty. People like Speaker McClinton, because she has said many times she couldn't turn away those calls, right? How can you? And to the point where it was one of her staff, part of their job was simply, there were so many calls coming in to respond to those folks' requests, right? And she viewed them as as her constituents, right? And no one else was. And many other districts folks who are representing high incarceration districts. Anyway, so we are moving thousands of people, right, from primarily urban areas to primarily rural areas, and that distorts representation for everyone, right? Because most of us do not live in a district with a prison. And so yes, there are incredibly stark, racially unequal impacts, but it really does impact all of us, right? It impacts most white rural residents. Again, most of them don't live near a prison, right? I've heard people get into little scuffles because they realize that their neighbor is technically within a district who has a prison, and that they have more political power than they do because they happen to be on the other side of the district boundary. And so what does that mean though, like in very, very real practical terms? It means that the person who has, we call them phantom constituents, right? The person who has 3,000 or 4,000 people who are actually just incarcerated in their district, we have, districts are around 65,000 people, right? That means if you live in a district, if you are an actual resident of a district, a meaningful, engaged community member that has a prison, it is so much easier for you to get a hold of your representative, for you to get your voice heard, for them to escalate your concern, right? Versus someone calling Representative McClinton she's got the 65,000 some people plus thousands more, right? And is already representing someone, the concerns, the communities that she's representing in the House, and I shouldn't keep using, there are many representatives, and she's just an example in the person's name at the top of my head right now. The concerns, back to Rory's point about the crime victims and whatnot, like having someone to represent your concerns in Harrisburg, that's meaningful, right? And those concerns are different than representatives who have phantom constituents, right? And so that's what we mean about like the power shifting and what does it actually mean, like versus it's so much harder despite having staff members dedicated to taking these calls to get your concerns heard. And there's often really dire concerns, right? Again, I got way away from the numbers because
I'll go back to the numbers.
the professor in me was like, I just need to make sure that we're clear. It's really, really, really complicated. Do you want to go to the numbers?
Let me pull a couple things through. Let me pull some threads there. That was actually really helpful. Thank you very much for that. And I actually want to ask 3 questions, but I land on that one too. One, Andrew, real quick question. I'm going to pull back to one of the comments you said. You talked about the LRC, right? 2030 comes. Are you going to have to renegotiate, all 4 of you are going to renegotiate with that next crew to be able to reset that entire thing?
I mean, yeah, it would.
Okay.
Yeah, you would have.
Great.
I mean,
So
I don't
every
know that
10
I'll be
years-
involved. I'd no longer work for
We
the
might need you to
legislature.
still be involved on
but-
that.
but
Okay,
Yes, I'm sure that they will all be
But
presenting.
as
before
we
the
think
LRC.
about tasks that this room might need to be able to support you on. So, okay, renegotiation in 2030, we all know there'll be a big task for everybody
Just
here.
a-
Okay, check.
Before we leave that, or you could help Carol, and we could pass a legitimate
Even
redistricting
better.
reform act
Legislation. Even
that would
better.
resolve this legislatively, so we don't have to do that fight again. Because as cool as it was to go to Harrisburg and whatnot, it was really tiring, and I don't really want to have to do it if I can avoid it. So I can go to other states and deal with them, which are far behind us.
Love that very much. I also appreciate the and whatnot coming back into the vernacular of this room. I'm really enjoying that. I also just want to note, Rory, that you used jazz hands around statistics tonight, and I think that should be mentioned out loud. It's like, we're giving
Those
you a
were
lot
magic.
of...
That was the
Well, I'm sorry.
magic of statistics.
Magic hands. I really want to just give you credit for that, Rory. It was amazing, and I think that it needed a verbal representation for that amazingness tonight. And then to your point, Briana, when you went through that tonight, that was a really fascinating vocabulary, like walkthrough that you just did with us. Is there ever been a case where a representative has sued another district for the amount of work that they have done for phantom representation they have done for other district members? Because that's exactly what McClinton is doing in that case. They are supporting representation for individual members from their district. I want to almost send the other district member a bill and say, I am representing, because that's what they're doing. That is, you're right. They do not have to raise as much funds. They do not have to campaign as much. And they are not spending their tax dollars for representation that they should be spending. And McClinton should say, okay, that is service that we are providing for your individuals, bill served. And I actually think that could have some legs in a court, or at least enough attention to be questioned.
I'm not aware of any cases that have been filed, but I have heard legislators bicker over it in other states. So as we have been happily supporting groups in other states, it is really interesting to see what matters to people. And in a place like Pennsylvania with, the unequal racial impact is what everybody wants to have front and center, and absolutely. But in other states like that are more libertarian focused, they're about the rural neighbors
Name
that
names.
are squabbling, right? Like, no. Really mattered. And in another rural state, it was one legislator pissed off that his buddy in the next district over had such an easier job, right? And like they were using it as it motivated them to want to consider ending prison gerrymandering.
Yeah.
But in terms of has there been anything formal? No, but you're right.
There was a lawsuit, I think in 2018 or 2019, filed by the NAACP of Pennsylvania on behalf of constituents living in districts that were underserved or underrepresented, and that's actually how I found out.
It cited our research.
That's how I learned about their research, and the Commonwealth Court punted and basically said, well, the LRC doesn't exist in this moment, again, legally, and so they punted and didn't address the issue at all. So it was a very compelling lawsuit, but that was dismissed.
No legislator on legislator lawsuits that we know of.
Yeah, it's very hard to get the court to address what is being done by other legal entities like that. One other thing I just wanted to mention, the implications, there's representational implications, but there's the policy outcomes of that. When you think about who is supporting mass incarceration, if there's a district who a lot of their jobs and a lot of their economy is based on the fact that there's a prison or two prisons, they are going to fight like crazy to keep the incarceration levels as high as possible. And I don't know if you know, but Pennsylvania, the life sentences for second, I'm going to get this wrong, and second degree murder, we're the state with the highest number of people with life incarceration for second degree murder. The Supreme Court has found that unconstitutional. Most states who have people incarcerated, and second degree murder is you were just an accessory to the crime. You might have been standing out there as a lookout and it happened over here and you had nothing to do with what actually happened. But if you were part of that thing, you could be incarcerated for life for second degree. Constitutionally, it's no longer permitted. The Supreme Court has said that's not allowed. But Pennsylvania still has a lot of people, hundreds, who are still incarcerated. That we have friends who were kids, who were accessories to crimes, who are still serving. And if you are a legislator in a place where those people are swelling the numbers of jobs and economy, you're going to fight hard against any kind of legislative fix of that. Whereas others, so there's a policy implication to all of this as well.
So let's go to audience questions. So if you have a question in the audience, please just raise your hand and our team will bring over the mic and just lean it towards you. And then we also have a whole bunch of people online across the country. So Kerry, when I point to you, you can read the questions from the online audience. So we have one question right here and Campbell will lean the mic over to you. So just—
I think it was Briana and Rory. Using the 2010 census data, and the 8 districts that you had talked about where the concentration of people that are incarcerated come from, was there ever any way to decipher the amount of money that would have been generated had these people been counted in their origin? I think you mentioned domicile, but their origin prior to being incarcerated. Clearly that's not their choice of residence. Right. Was there any way, or was there any question to figure out what that dollar amount would look like that would come back to the constituents in the area that, of course, did not benefit because they don't live by the prisons?
Right. So no, but there's also an important caveat here as well, right? Which is that very little money is actually doled out based on the census counts that are involved in redistricting, right? There's basically all the money that the U.S. government gives out to states for various reasons are targeted to particular populations for particular reasons, for whatever the case may be. Right? Now, there's a lot of money that is being affected by these policy decisions that is downstream from bad representation. But I can't put a dollar figure to that. But the idea that formulas for road budgets or formulas for educational funding or things like that isn't going to be tied to to the census and redistricting. That's going to be tied to how many kids are going to that school, how many people drive on that road, those types of formulas. So this is, it sounds like I'm saying like, don't worry about this, but actually this is one of those things that is really important because the number one, don't you dare do this, is the fear in those districts that have prisons that they're going to lose money. Right. And they're actually not. It doesn't touch their money at all. It just touches representation. And the Prison Policy Initiative that has a great kind of explainer in detail about how little the dollar figures related to census redistricting numbers are. But it's not, this is not how it affects dollars. It affects dollars downstream in the fact that rural populations are overrepresented, and so rural interests might get a little overrepresented in the state budget the next year. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
It's hard to believe, but it's
Disappointing. It's really disappointing.
I'm interested in seeing the reverse of how much money the actual inmate and the incentive to continue to incarcerate
Oh.
from our area,
Oh,
so that
huge.
they can manufacture
Huge.
holding.
Yes.
And the profits from that.
That,
So I think
that is
reverses-
massive, but that's not related to the redistricting issue. That's related to just incarcerating.
Yeah.
That's just incarceration. No matter where we count people for the district, there's still going to be someone in prison, and we still need to pay someone to guard. We still decide we want to pay someone to guard them. We still decide we wanted to build a prison, so on and so forth. That's going to happen regardless of if they're counted as living here or living there.
Right, but when, I think it was Briana mentioned how that particular district that might have 2 actual people living within that boundary of the prison, so you have so much more resources for a smaller population that lives there than the population you're pulling the incarcerated people from.
Can I just? I just want to say, because while it's not like a one-to-one, and it's probably not really quantifiable, the politics of the Capitol building. I mean, we have an incredibly close legislature, right? So, like in the House, if one district switches, that changes the entire leadership structure of who's in charge and who makes decisions. And so, when you're negotiating budgets and you're negotiating programs, the individual players who have inflated power end up being able to direct more money to their district because they are in power. So it's not, I don't know that it could ever be quantified. I'm also not an economist, but it definitely impacts those decisions, especially when it comes to a chamber that is like razor's edge close.
Hi guys, my name is Kayla Prito-Hodge. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers. Hello to my social scientists. My question is specifically about prison closures and whether or not this plays into the conversation around advocacy, as well as I guess like a political drive around counting prisoner populations.
What research shows, there's not, at this point, there's certainly it's more of a myth now that, and I know you know this, but that having a prison in your community is going to be a beneficial thing, right? The long-term benefits are not there, right? Our prisons we're not seeing a huge prison closure trend. In fact, Pennsylvania now has more people incarcerated than it's creeping back up. So in terms of the role of it impacting the things we've been talking about, I don't think it's a huge concern, but the politics of my experience has been that there is a lot less overt, and there's 1 or 2 exceptions, which are fantastic, like people were recorded talking about using incarcerated people's bodies to stack districts in Florida, for example, once. But by and large, this is like, people aren't actively sitting around talking about it in terms of the politics of keeping a prison open, the politics of even like, at least to my knowledge, there hasn't, and it's interesting, right? But it's also, it's one of those things where it's like people don't know that it's happening. It's kind of invisible in a way, right? Like, and so there doesn't seem to be, I think it's interesting that it's not more central. Like you're shining a light on something that just hasn't been paid a lot of attention to in those rooms, to my knowledge, and who knows, right, what the future holds, but yeah.
Hi. I'm not sure I understood, but I'm going to state what I understood, and you can tell me if it's wrong. But it seemed like you said that as part of the, I guess, 2020 census process, Pennsylvania revisited this issue, and with the exception of the longer-term inmates, made the decision, okay, we're going to treat these people basically as where they reside, whatever that
Where they're
means.
from.
Where they're from. So can you articulate either statistically or examples, whatever, the before and after? What did it look like before and what changed? Can you, like, are there some concrete examples? It seems like if there was a change, you ought to be able to say, look, this is what in fact happened statistically, anecdotally, whatever is the easiest way. I mean, I'd like statistics, but anecdotally, if that works,
Well,
sure.
I don't have statistics, but I do have anecdotes about the map, right? Because if we're talking about, like, this is about how you draw these district boundaries. So House District 50, which is in the southwest corner of the state, had one jail with, or one prison with, I think, like 3,000 people in it. When those prisoners, none of them were from the district, right? So they all had to be reallocated. And what that meant was the district had to grow in geography and absorb new communities, right? That had not been represented by that person in the past. So like literally the district boundary creeped east just a little bit. And that sounds small, but there's a cascading effect across the entire state. And when you compound that with what happened in the census count overall in 2020, where you saw, you know, a huge emptying of the western part of the state, of the northern tier of the state, and big concentration of population increases in the southeast, it all sort of worked together to move everything a little bit east.
So did the representation change, like across those districts? How did it shake out? He's asking, like, did representation change across the way?
mean-
I feel like, yeah.
Had this many people before, when they took away those 5,000, 4,000, whatever prisoners, and now it's this many people, and
So-
You have to absorb more people to make the district even with all of the others, right? So you have to absorb new constituents. New people have to be living in that district. So the district has to get physically larger.
But the boundaries just shift a little bit. To be like extra clear, ending prison gerrymandering did not like blow up the map
no.
in Pennsylvania and make it unrecognizable and wait, like we're talking about really subtle shifts in like a couple of miles. Like, but Rory, please go.
so would you say it's more of a service issue that the people, the constituents that, you know, were in the previously inflated, I'll call it, district because of the prison, they had better service because their representatives, they didn't treat those 4,000 prisoners, so the relationship between that representative or representatives and their population was a higher ratio than after the prisoners were removed and more, quote, real constituents were moved in. Is it more like a service
So-
thing?
I
so
think it's an
it-
equity issue.
It's an equity issue. So yes, and, right? That's one aspect of the problem here. The other thing, Pennsylvania, as flawed as its 2010s maps were, like the way that I think about it, and forgive me, it's dinner time, and I'm a foodie and all that. So I'm going to do a food metaphor, right? I think of prison gerrymandering because it is kind of at these margins, only where there are prisons, only where there's a high incarceration rate type of thing. Like you're making a dish of redistricting. And if you're trying to gerrymander, right, you're going to use race, you're going to use partisanship, you're going to pack and crack, you're going to do all the gerrymandering things. And then you add a little sprinkle of prisons as your finishing salt. And it just boom, right? That's what can happen. And when I say can happen, I mean that's what Texas did. So if you look at Texas, which was gerrymandering itself as much as it could, right? And then you say, well, what if they didn't have prisons to use as part of that? Whether they were using it consciously or not, what if they didn't have prisons to use? And there are dozens of state house districts in Texas that are egregiously unconstitutional because they were skirting the edge. And then the prison gerrymandering pushes them over, right? Pennsylvania wasn't being as aggressively partisan as Texas. So the effect was 4 districts too big, 4 districts too small, hundreds of thousands of people having worse service or worse equity than other people. But if you combine it with other forms of gerrymandering, if you combine it with high racial disparities in incarceration, if you combine it with high income inequalities, which leads to these kind of pockets of incarceration, then you see cases like Texas. You see, if you look at the 2020 maps in Georgia, the Brennan Center did an analysis with our data. They said there would be 6 or 8 more majority black state house districts in Georgia if not for prison gerrymandering in Georgia. If you look at Ohio, which also is a super partisan gerrymandering state, they have like a dozen or so state districts that rely on prison gerrymandering to be constitutionally viable. So it's kind of one piece of the puzzle. And to me, it's like that last little bit, because people often don't think about it, and you don't think about, and then when you think about it, boom.
It's a tidal wave. It crests when you get to the surface. It crests when you get to the edge of the thing, and then it becomes so overwhelming. It makes this huge impact. And I think when you get to 2020 and you wipe the state clean, and then you get to rewrite everything and clean it all off and do it with the fairness, wipe off that extra sprinkle, then you get the equity. Then you get the fairness back. And then looking across the state, and what we have 19 states now that are putting in laws that's to really start to redo that and clear that through. So, as we kind of wrap this up, Carol, I'm going to ask you for the last word on what's next. We know we can get that law to be moving forward. We know as a backup plan, we come back in on 2030 as a backup plan, not one we want to do, but a backup plan. But Carol, what's next on this work?
Yeah, so the question was what happens in 2030? Our goal is to have a bill passed by 2030. So you all had one of these on your seats. Fair Districts PA has 2 bills, Senate Bill 131 and House Bill 31. We have 23 co-sponsors on Senate Bill 131, which is really close to half of the Senate. We have 65 co-sponsors on House Bill 31. We will run out of time. It takes a long time to pass a constitutional amendment in Pennsylvania. It has to go through both chambers, 2 successive sessions, and it has to pass in that chamber 3 months before the next general election. So our deadline for the bills this session is when they recess for the summer. We've just got a few months. So we ask people to take this, sign the petition. There's a place you could text to sign the petition on the back. But the more energy we can put behind this, the more we can influence legislators to move it. And there are lots of Philly legislators you think would be saying, let's fix this fast, who haven't heard from us, who just kind of, whatever. We have quite a few Philly legislators who are co-sponsors. We have quite a few who just haven't done anything. So our goal is to have a bill in place by 2031 that would address all of these gerrymandering questions. And the language in the current proposed bill is, we asked the Prison Policy Initiative that's done a ton of work on this issue, what are the states that have done the best work on this? Give us the best language. They gave us that language, and then that's the language that's in the bill, that people at every level would be counted at their home communities. If we don't know their home communities, they would not be counted for the purposes of redistricting, so that there wouldn't be these pockets of incarceration that would be throwing things off. So that's a bill. We'd love your help in just reaching out to legislators. We're working hard to do this. We're going to have a rally in Harrisburg on June 3rd. You're all invited. And then we talked about advocating with the Census Bureau. We did that last decade. We'll do it again. My friends here told me it's not going to happen. But then the other piece, which is really important, is if we don't get the bill passed, as Andrew said, we went and gave testimony. I gave testimony multiple times to the Legislative Reapportionment Commission, and the last time they took lots of testimony, and it made a big difference, which is why we have much better maps now than we did last decade. So it's really important that the public pay attention. It's really important that people understand this issue. It's important to get engaged. Democracy does not happen magically. It happens because people insist on representation and on fair representation. So take that little thing home, share it with your friends and neighbors, sign our petition, and help us get this moving forward.
That democracy is a verb. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to this amazing panel.